Welcome to the ASCM's, the Chain Podcast. Before COVID, most people had a very abstract idea about supply chain, even the term supply chain. Most of us understood that you press a button on your phone and you place an order, you pay a fee, and a couple of days later, or even the day of, a package arrives at your house. We're now in an era of the curious consumer. They're digging into supply chain in many ways and where their packages come from, how to track it, and how long is it going to take to get there. That's why I'm excited to have Professor Doug Thomas joining me. Doug is a professor at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and an expert on supply chain management and strategy. His research interests include supply chain strategy, inventory planning, and effective management of supply chain partners. Doug, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Abe. Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
A curious topic on packaging, something probably 10 or 15 years ago that we didn't pay a lot of attention to. Why are we paying attention to it today? What is it that's interesting about packaging?
As somebody that's spent a couple of decades working in and studying supply chain, COVID and other geopolitical things have not been the best for society, but they've drawn a lot of attention to things that we're interested in. And it's raised awareness. So people that before saw things like, well, stuff just shows up in the grocery store, stuff shows up at my house in a package, were forced to start thinking about things they didn't think about before. So packaging in particular is, I'm a professor, so I'm capable of overcomplicating things, but it's just the stuff that your goods come in. It can include corrugated cardboard, of course, and bubble wrap or insulated packaging, dry ice if it's frozen food. That's the most recent package I just opened. So it can be a bunch of things, but we're starting to be, as consumers, more aware of it. Businesses have been paying attention to packaging for a long time, of course.
From a company standpoint, cost and efficiency is always at the top of their priorities. What about the consumer? What's their concern about the packaging?
Consumers want their things to show up undamaged. And so it's always been the case that consumers care about the packaging of safely delivering their product. It's a hassle to get something that's broken. You have to go through the returns process. Estimates are 15 to 20% of e-commerce purchases end up being returned. And of course, if you, as the consumer, are responsible, like I got to find a box, I got to find bubble wrap. So making the packaging accessible to manage that returns process. It's interesting, people lots of retailers talk about free shipping. Yeah. I try to make a point of saying included shipping. So it's not free. Somebody pays for it. It's built into whatever you're paying. Packaging's the same way, that you don't think, oh, I'm paying for the shipping, or I'm paying for the box, or I'm paying for the corrugated as a consumer. But companies, of course, think about that. So the reduced damage is of mutual interest to the consumer and the business. And then more and more consumers are starting to pay attention to can you reduce the material usage? Can you reduce the impact of the packaging? Is it recyclable? Those kinds of issues are more and more in the consumer's mind these days.
You bring up an interesting point about awareness, specifically the environmental impact. Our good friend Yossi Sheffi at MIT talks about the criteria for most consumers being price, and price. Are we still in that environment, or are we seeing changes in terms of the consumer's awareness of it, whether demographically or otherwise?
In general, it's a good idea to agree with Yossi. He's usually right. I don't know exactly when he said that. I mean, we might be creeping up on concerns about social and environmental as maybe displacing the third price. So it may be that the top three are still price. The top two are certainly still price. But there's been a consistent uptick in consumer concern, awareness of broadly environmental and social concerns, both as a consumer side, and we're talking about this from a consumer perspective. One other place where we see that is the so-called ESG, environmental social governance funds, that we're approaching $50 trillion, a third of assets under management of ESG funds. So consumers are caring. Those same consumers as investors are thinking about, I'm caring about this. So it's been increasing. Actually, interesting that you bring this up. The there's been a steady, slow march upward about consumers caring about this. It took a dip sort of post-COVID with tough, some job losses, some displacement, and lots of other factors, and then inflation. So it took a dip, and what that dip shows is exactly what Yossi says, which is prices at the top. It says if I'm struggling to buy groceries and pay my rent, I'm not caring about. I'm not caring as much or putting my money toward these things. But when economic times are a little bit better, we see an uptick.
Interesting. There's been a lot of conversations about demographics, about who cares about what, and are we consistent in terms of our spending with our values and our expectations, and the discussion about my generation, the MXers and the boomers. We have a say-do gap. We indicate that we're more concerned about environmental impact, but yet we don't spend that way. Is there a demographic shift that's occurring that we need to pay attention to?
Are you asking if our kids are more environmentally responsible than you?
Yeah.
Are you saying it's your fault for all the? No.
A little bit of both, I think.
Well, I don't know. Most of the studies that look at this want the biggest pool of consumers available. The fact that there's been an upward trend, I think, reflects values. I also think a whole bunch of the say-do gap is an information gap. And I'll give you an example. There was a study in Europe around packaging of what do you as a consumer care about, and what have you executed on? And there's a say-do gap across all of those dimensions. So the say-do gap exists. Now, the say is going up and the do is going up. There still remains a gap, but they're both going up. And interestingly, the smallest gap was in, call it local or regional sourcing. I want to buy things from my area. I want to buy things made in my country. And the biggest gaps were around environmental impact of how the product gets to me, and were the right labor conditions. Was it ethical labor? It was actually where there was the biggest gap. Yep. And what's hard to disentangle from that is it's two things. It's our values, and it's also this information gap, which is I can see a country, it's stamped on the product, made in the USA. It's very easy information for me to acquire. And it's really hard. We were talking about this the other day. It was like, if you wanted to do the right thing with all of your purchases, you could do it, but you would have to quit your job and do nothing but research of like, where did this come from, and which supplier did what? And so I think some of the gap is we aspire to do things, and then when the wallet comes out, we care about price. And another is there's a big information gap in certain parts of this that I think is starting to get closed. You and I know, working with supply chain professionals, right? There's more and more investment in companies tracking things throughout their supply chain, but I don't think that's fully been translated for the consumer yet.
Interesting point you're bringing about information, obviously being sort of the holy grail of supply chains. Tell me what your demand signals are, and I'll be able to respond, in terms of supply. The gaps that occurred during the pandemic on visibility, traceability, and we theoretically have filled those gaps. So very few supply chain professionals can walk into the C-suite and say, I don't know who or what is in my supply chain anymore. Good news. Bad news is we now know everybody and everything in our supply chains.
Yeah.
To your point, the information gap, it's not as readily accessible for the general consumer to find out where and how and who touched their products. The companies have been investing millions in digital transformation. Are we getting closer to providing that access to information so we can have an informed consumer?
We're getting there. I mean, one of the big challenges for people not super familiar with supply chains, you think like, oh, you buy some steel and assemble it into a car. How hard can that be to track? Or you buy some groceries and the grocery company delivers. You go far enough, what we call upstream in the supply chain, and there's what are called artisanal mines and smallholder farms, and it's really fragmented. So the idea of hey, we can tell you exactly what patch of land the wheat came from that fed to this, that got to that. We're not there. Companies still know a huge amount more, and in fact, consumers want to know, investors want to know, government regulators want to know, when they want this sort of traceability and responsibility. And you're right in that the first wave 20 some years ago, 25 years ago, with the internet, sort of enabled a bunch of information gathering. We're now in another round of digital transformation, as you appropriately put it, of tracking all of that. So we're getting there. That I think creates a marketing problem. I know we're the supply chain management folks talking today, but if you think about this information gap with consumers, of companies could say, like, hey, consumer, come on in for a 3-day seminar and we'll tell you everything about our supply chain, isn't going to happen. So figuring out what are the things consumers care about and messaging those from the supply chain to the consumer, I think, is going to be something we'll see a lot of progress on in the coming year. You're right to say there's progress in our ability as supply chain professionals to see what's going on.
Yeah.
It's a question of how do we use that both to improve operations and message to the consumer.
Yeah, a really interesting point, because the other gaps that we identified were, transparency and traceability. I think we've made some progress on the visibility. I'm not sure we've made a lot of progress on the transparency and traceability just yet. Generally, the consumers, we're in a global environment right now, and yet a lot of discussion about nearshoring and reshoring. Is this, how big of an impact will this have on packaging if we are moving closer to the consumer, as opposed to the global logistics network that enables our manufacturing and sourcing from almost anywhere?
Right. So the bulk of my career has been over a time in supply chain where the biggest issue up until COVID and years before was, how can we global source most effectively? How can we go find low-cost countries to source various inputs from? And then the global logistics network followed, the rise in ports and efficiency of transportation, all of that. And you're right, now there's at least lots of discussion of nearshoring, reshoring, and there's a variety of reasons for that. I think it's going to happen slowly, because if you look at the US, for example, of 30 years ago, what percentage of the workforce was in manufacturing, and that percentage now, it's hard to sort of go snap your fingers and, okay, everybody stop doing these jobs and start doing these other jobs. There's big infrastructure spending, but companies continue to talk about it. They talk about it for these reasons of, I mentioned the study where the closest gap between say and do is local source. So consumers like this idea, and we know there's you're not exposed to port disruptions, canal issues, things like that, if you do more of the activity locally. So I think we'll continue to see it. I just think that in some industries, it's going to take a very long time. Like we're seeing it in the US in semiconductors and other electronics manufacturing, where there's government incentives to do more nearshoring, but you don't just lease a new building and fire up a new semiconductor plant, right? It's a huge investment in years in planning.
Yeah, and yet on the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing a rise of low-cost manufacturing, low-cost producers. The apparel industry has been really hard knocked on this with Shein and Temu in terms of low-cost products, fast fashion, get it in, get it out as soon as possible. The quality and sustainability seem to be running at odds with each other here. How do we balance this expectation of low cost and rapid delivery and low cost labor?
The march of consumer awareness, and we do this, and then you have Shein and Temu growing at 30-50% annual growth, projected to slow down. I don't know how it couldn't slow down given how rapid it's been, but projected to slow down in 2025. That supports the view that says, yeah, we're going to, as consumers, care a little bit more, but man, you give us a smoking hot deal, we're going to take it. Interesting thing there, interesting to me, an academic. I don't know how you start a sentence, but what's really interesting about Byzantine trade policy documents. But interesting thing there about trade policy documents is in 2016 in the U.S. we raised the limit, the dollar amount for exemption from any tariffs. If you ship something that raised it from $200 to $800, of saying if you ship something in that's under $800, we don't want the administrative burden of trying to figure it out. And as a concept, you think like, well, I guess that kind of makes sense, right? You don't want to micromanage every little thing, but that's what's called the de minimis, that's under $800, is what Shein and Temu have been using. And I saw an estimate that 30% of the shipments coming in under this de minimis thing are Shein and Temu only. They make up 30% of all of it. And I think we'll see change to it. I think we're going to see, there's the incoming U.S. administration is going to do something around this is exemption from a tariff. They may address that, but that's sort of what's been fueling it. But you're right, it's sort of this counterpoint of like, hey, we care more, but we love a smoking hot deal. I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. Like, I don't see a future where we get away and every consumer is, I'm going to pay extra and wait longer for everything that I buy and research all of it. But yeah, it's certainly the case that they've been growing, and I think there'll be trade policy that make some adjustment to that.
You brought up a couple interesting points about, sort of the nearshoring and reshoring and, sort of the necessary ecosystem to enable that remanufacturing or that, the shift over there, and, whether it's labor force or whether it's the ecosystem on suppliers. Obviously there's quite a bit of rhetoric on nearshoring and reshoring. Are we looking at this as a short-term solution or a long-term solution? Because as you indicated, you just don't put up a fab plant in quarters. It takes years.
Well, I'll talk first from a U.S. perspective, and then there are similar things going on in other, in Western Europe and other places. I think the same thing that happened 30 years ago when we started this global sourcing thing is that different industries will move at different rates. I've been doing some work looking in detail at apparel trade agreements, and the U.S. for the last more than 10 years at least, and accelerated by this nearshoring trend, is looking to help build up apparel in southern border, broadly defined Caribbean basin countries. I don't see a future where we say, you know what, we're going to cut, make, and trim our own garments. And so then you see some things, and we mentioned semiconductors, where the U.S. probably appropriately perceives some national security issues, and it's expensive equipment, hot, good paying manufacturing jobs, and says we want to look at this. And something we can touch on a little bit is, what's the arc of automation, right? So you have all of these factors that push toward nearshoring and reshoring. I like to be close to market.
Yeah.
Consumers care. Consumers seem to respond well to made here. Mm-hmm. That study I mentioned was in Europe. There's, I'm sure, analogous studies for the U.S. Automation, the capabilities of automation continue to increase. What drove the global sourcing 30, 40 years ago was labor arbitrage. I want to go for, right? So as the labor content of the work comes down and the manufacture, the automation technology gets better, that all pushes all of these factors. This I'm more resilient, consumers like it, automation's getting better. All of those things push toward more nearshoring and onshoring. It's just that the cost of the inputs and the cost of the labor is still a whole lot lower in other places in the world and developing countries than it is here. And so everything is moving this direction. So I don't think it's not going to go back the other way even more. It's just a question of how rapidly or slowly that moves.
Give me a sense, Doug. Are we talking about more on regulatory and policy as the impetus, or are we talking more about the consumer and organizations doing the right thing? Because I think we'd agree the majority of companies are going to do it because they have to, not because they want to be leaders in this industry. We've seen a number of examples of organizations claiming either on their carbon footprint or on their sustainability, metrics that they're not clearly as clean or as sustainable as they claim. Are we looking more regulatory and policy, or are we looking more as the industry pushing this?
You're right, of course, that uh, for-profit companies are for-profit companies and have a responsibility to society and their consumers and their workers and their shareholders. When do you need policy? You need policy when the natural forces in place, that collection of stakeholders I just mentioned, the natural forces in place don't do the thing that you think should happen as a policymaker. So in the US, and there's similar legislation in South Korea about the Chips and Science Act, it's the US saying we as policymakers and the federal government of the United States see some things that we want to have happen. They're not happening because of the existing forces, so we're going to subsidize. So that aspirationally, philosophically, is when you should have regulation or trade policy, but it's when it's not going to happen otherwise. You mentioned sort of industries leading it. I mean, there are examples where industries have gotten together for a mix of their own business interests and societal interests. The electronics industry in particular took the lead in what's called the RBA, the Responsible Business Alliance, and set global standards. If you look at your laptop, there might be something on it that says TCO compliant. It means that thing was made with a certain set of global standards on labor and work hours and conditions like that. The UN sets sustainable development goals that touch on that all the member countries agreed on. So there's non-government agencies and industries that are doing some things, but I think policy is going to play a big role.
Yeah, the unfortunate part, it becomes a checklist or a compliance issue when it gets into the regulatory policy, as opposed to the true impact that that we're hoping to achieve, whether through tracing or whether through reporting. I think we have a little bit ways to go there. I want to go back to one of the topics you brought up before, and that was automation and the impact that it's having on our supply chains, not only on the labor force, but in terms of ports, in terms of warehousing, last mile delivery. The role of automation within packaging and delivery today, significant opportunities there.
Yeah, I think there are, and there's some interesting observations of companies pushing the technology boundary and parts where it may be lagging. So maybe let's think through a package, right? We ordered something for the holiday season or any other time, and it came from somewhere quite likely still far away, as here we are talking about nearshoring and onshoring. There's still a lot of stuff coming from far away, which means it got on an ocean container and what's called a container. We measure containers in 20-foot equivalent units, although most of them are 2 times that. For the non-supply chain people that are still listening to us talk about supply chain stuff, that's the big Lego block thing that you see on cruise ships. The product comes through there. It's got to be packaged to survive this voyage, where bad packaging would have lots of damage rates, and then packaged in a way that it can, in a streamlined way, go through receiving in the port, get into a warehouse, get on a truck, all of that. So if we think of a package making this ocean voyage, could be air depending on the value of the product, but making some voyage in, it's going to go through a port, it's going to get in a warehouse, it's going to sit in that warehouse until someone orders it, it's going to be picked in the warehouse, and then there's going to be the last mile delivery. And I think there's interesting things about automation at those 3 steps. So if we think about the port, the warehouse, and the last mile delivery, we've seen in the US, there's still a negotiation going on with the East Coast longshoremen. And one of the issues is automation in the ports. The US ports, some of them have significant amounts of automation, some don't. There's ports around the world. The biggest ports in the world have, on average, more automation than us. Singapore and Shanghai are among the biggest ports and have a lot of automation there. I think something to think about when you talk about automation is it's not 0-1. It's not like, oh, if it's not automated, I have a bunch of guys like you and me, moving boxes around. Not us. We're probably too old and weak now, but you get the idea. But it's everything that's automated is semi-automated. It's just a question of how which end it is. So let's just go through ports, warehouses, last mile. Ports is really interesting because it's a big talking point in the labor negotiations. You see major ports around the world with very differing levels, and it's not like you can say automation is certainly good or automation is bad. It's on a case-by-case basis. There have been some investments on automation where you're like, this might have been okay economically, but it slowed things down, which causes some other congestion problems. There's also this odd relationship with labor. It's not clear that it's a one-for-one labor displacement. One of the very large European port, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, invested huge amounts in automation, grew the volume that they handled, and jobs grew. And in fact, they can't fill them. Yeah. So you can invest in automation and grow and handle more volume. The most automated, probably depending on how you count, the most automated port in the US, Port of Virginia, down the road from me, had 25% growth in productivity last year. Two main factors there. One is they were able to handle it. The other is that there was an unfortunate incident in Baltimore that created the demand need for it. As an academic that studies these things, what you always hope for is nuance in the discussions about the things you know and care deeply about, because it's not clear that sort of against all automation or for automation is the right view now. There have been points in history where we've said, like back in the 50s, I mentioned this TEU, the standardized ocean container, among the most important things logisticians have ever done, right? Like without question. Dock workers in the 50s and 60s opposed it. Like, we don't want this because it'll make things more efficient. And it was clearly a good thing. Some of the automation, right? You can point to some of the automation now. It's like, this is kind of a mixed bag. There's also benefits to workers too, right? Like what we'd really like to do is create, we don't want to create jobs. We want to create good jobs. The more automated plants can put workers less in harm's way, right? They can make the job less sort of physically demanding and safety issues. So there's a lot of nuance around that discussion, but I think it's going to be a topic of conversation, and all of that's going to affect, like, what do we want as consumers? I've went off for a while about ports. Like, what do we want as consumers? Like, I want my stuff fast and undamaged, and so port automation can do that.
Interesting. You talked about the other two, the warehouse and the last mile delivery. I remember back when the ships were stacking up off the ports back in the pandemic, and our administration in there, again, very smart people. Let's get those ships off the water. Let's get the product onto the shore. We didn't have the warehouse. We didn't have the truckers. We don't have the retail space. So we kicked the can down the road a little bit in terms of what the problem is. Have we addressed the labor issue on last mile delivery and the warehouses, or are we still holding our breath on another disruption there?
Hopefully we don't have another disruption on the grand and global scale of the COVID pandemic, because we couldn't handle a disruption of that magnitude again. It's also not clear to me. It's probably the case that that shouldn't be our planning process, right? We shouldn't say we're going to have 5x the capacity and everything and not use it. That doesn't mean we can't do better. I mean, your question points out something that people like us think about, but you may not, which is, I have this thing that gets the package to the consumer, this collection of resources, and there's a weakest link, and I may not know what it is, right? So your example is exactly right. Like, well, these ships are on the water. Let's get them off the water. Like, well, there's no place to put them. there's no drivers to move them out. So we tend to analyze these things more in isolation than we ought to. I have, we'll see. There's lots of companies talking about resilience, although I, for fun, have over the years pulled up quotes from folks saying, it's a CEO of a major corporation that said, "We can't let this virus disrupt the global supply chain." And the quote was from 2003, and it was about SARS. And there's a quote from folks around the Tohoku earthquake that disrupted automotive that said, "This is a wake-up call. We've learned our lesson. We're going to do this," right? And so you see this cycle repeat. So I don't know, some mix of optimistic and skeptical about have we invested in this? COVID was sort of like, we had these disruptions, earthquakes, and where we didn't have huge disruption to the labor force, right? One of the things that was unique about the COVID pandemic was all of a sudden I had, well, I can't put, I can't get workers can't come in to do the work, and of course automation would address that. I mean, on the warehouse side, automation, right? Amazon is opening this 3 million square foot facility in Louisiana. For context, 3 million square feet is a gigantic fulfillment center, probably 4 times a typical one for them. And that's sort of a showplace for their automation. Two things about that is they're obviously pushing the boundaries of what we can do with automation, which is reliable and, doesn't care about social distancing. And but that facility is still projected to have 2,500 workers in it. So there's still lots of workers in it. Now, for context, it's less than half what you'd expect of the workers relative to their other fulfillment centers, but it's still 2,500 jobs. Furthermore, warehouse work is difficult, and there's 50% turnover. Half the workforce leaves every year, and so it may be, and then, I'm not a labor economist, but you have to, when you talk about automation of it's reducing employment here. Someone's making the robots, someone's delivering the robots, right? It's creating jobs somewhere else.
Are there examples of companies that are using packaging and or delivery as a differentiator for themselves, that, they're accelerating their focus on this and clearly leaping ahead of the competition?
Yeah, I think we see it more in in higher end in higher end goods. So, if I have a consumer that's deeply attached to a company, and a big part of that company's branding is, their sustainability, right? You go to their website and they're anxious to tell you their story. Then you see that it's packaged in a way that is consistent with that. I see it in a small number of examples. I mean, most of the things that are coming to my house are coming in corrugated cardboard and the same kind of packaging, and it's not it's recyclable but not reusable. One of the challenges in the near future for people running supply chains is that we sort of went from throw everything away to like, oh, now we're going to recycle it. There's lots of recycling we do that's better than landfilling it, but it's still not very efficient, right? If you have to take something and melt it down or burn it or whatever to get the stuff out of it, that's pretty inefficient relative to reuse. So I see not a lot of reusable packaging, and I think it's a big opportunity.
Especially in the reverse logistics being a significant part of the global supply chain today. There are indications that e-commerce 30+% of any product that's bought online is returned, and we're seeing a lot of companies saying, you know what, don't return it. It costs me too much to return the product. So we've got the reverse logistics. Give me a sense also with RFID and how low the cost is relative to tracing products right now. Are we getting to the point where we'll be able to trace everything at any time?
The march keeps coming. I mean, RFID, in fact, is a very interesting technology. You and I have been at this for long enough that I don't know. It's 20 years ago when it was like, oh man, RFID is the future and everything's going to be tagged. There's been sort of 4 or 5 cycles of 5 years from now, it's going to be like this. Eventually, one of those predictions will be true. But yeah, I mean, the tagging of things of like, great, isn't it great that we can track everything both forward and reverse?
Yeah.
Has been sort of a promise for a while. The cost does keep coming down, and you are starting to see more and more adoption. I think we're a long way off from everything, because even if you get RFID tag or some other way of tracing down to pennies, companies that sell thousands and millions of products, a few pennies here and there matters. And so at low cost goods, I think we're still going to see it. I mean, you make an interesting point about, right, it's a pretty jarring thing when you say, like, I have sent you a product, I've incurred the cost of all of the packaging, I've incurred the cost of the product itself,
yeah,
and the delivery, and I, as the company, am better off for you just to keep it. Yeah. Including, by the way, like some of the more difficult things to deliver, particularly last mile, are big, bulky furniture, right? If you're like, oh, the couch is broken, like, just keep it, we'll send it another one, is pretty jarring. The last mile, I mean, the thing that it would be good for the broader consumer to know is estimates vary, but half the total shipping cost is incurred in the last mile, right? It's a huge amount. And, and as you mentioned earlier, right, we like good deals on stuff and we like getting them fast. And so, that, like, if you say, like, oh, we're going to do this slightly better eco diesel or autonomous and the big trucking part, it's great, we should do it. But half the cost is in this last mile piece. And you're starting to see automation come in a little bit there, right? There's still drivers in the trucks. There's companies, Amazon, for example, got permission from the FAA, the governing body in the US, about flight, to do drone delivery without line of sight. So the rules used to be, you got to have a pilot's license like a regular pilot. They backed off on that. It has to be 1-to-1. The operator can only control one drone rather than show up in a neighborhood and send a bunch of drones out. And you have to be able to see it at all times, line of sight. And the FAA let them do not line of sight. I don't know how consumers broadly feel about it, but retailers would love it if you, the consumer, would do alternate pickup location. If you would sign into these partnerships of, like, lockers at your place of work or at a convenience store, right? Because again, that most of the cost is that last mile. And if you're like, oh, I'm going to the store anyway and pick it up. So I think those are the pieces, some of it automation, some of it consumer behavior, that are going to help improve that bit. I don't know what's going to move the returns thing. I mean, it's returns are crazy high, and companies have talked about it, but it hasn't moved very much.
We've gone down to getting the package to our doorstep. Let's elevate it all the way to the top right now. Global supply chains. Are we looking more at regionalization with nearshoring, reshoring in terms of compliance, or are we talking still about a global supply chain? Because a lot of the rhetoric, even out of the EU, on compliance, on traceability, on 11 products over there, that's just for the EU. That's not for the rest of the world. But yet, if you're sourcing from these companies or from these countries, you're going to have to, be aware of it. Just last week, we had Apple indicating that they should not source anymore from the Congo, from DRC. But yet, the companies are saying, prove that you're not sourcing from there. How close are we getting to, traceability and visibility into the supply chain on a global basis?
Democratic Republic of Congo is an example of some of the more difficult situations from a traceability standpoint. And perhaps not. I don't want to. It's not the topic of our podcast to moralize about the right or wrong kinds of behavior, right? But if a regulator or a set of companies or consumers are saying, we don't want you to, be relying on this particular country for these particular reasons, the issue is, how can you do it? So Apple, right? Apple does not have an engineering design office in DRC. Apple does not have an assembly plant in DRC.
Right.
What Apple needs is critical minerals that
Right.
that come from DRC, and electronics is one place, but agriculture and apparel are other places where you
Yep.
have these things come into marketplaces, and you know where it came from, and you know it came into this marketplace, but it is metaphorically dumped into a big bin.
Yeah.
Right? And so it says, I went to buy cobalt or lithium from a commodity broker, and I know they got 20% of their stuff from this place and 30%. Like, it is not possible to know this particular hunk came from wherever. And I don't know of a near-term solution to that. A lot of the traceability things are actually done by what they call mass balance, which is they say, this is what stuff came in. We're assuming that you got that share of that stuff. You asked, where are we going with this? I mean, I think you're starting to see more and more detailed trade agreements or regulation of saying, so you take in the US, the US Mexico Canada agreement and the Inflation Reduction Act that put in new rules to replace NAFTA, essentially, and subsidies for electric vehicles and electric vehicle battery production. They put in rules that said, in the near future, in coming years, you must get the minerals, at least this percent of minerals, from people that we have agreements with or something. I think one of the things I hope for is that the people setting policy understand operational realities. I think the same thing is a bit of a departure, but I think the same thing about energy production, of saying, I want 100% carbon free or 100% renewable. We know as people that run operations that say, you make me get to 100% anything, and it's outrageously hard and expensive. You back off to pick the number 95, 90%, and then you're like, yeah, great. And so I think what we're going to need to do is write policy that says, we know it's impossible to eliminate every little last bit. We're going to put the bar high, but not too high. And that, of course, is high but not too high isn't a very right. But conceptually, you get the idea of, like, there's going to be some stuff that's intermingled, and it's going to be a long time before we can trace all of it.
Really a dynamic environment. I'd like to pick up this conversation in about 6 months from now and to see how much progress, or even a year, to your point before, we can go back and listen to all the proclamations that companies have made. How right we are, how close.
Look at what these jokers were saying 6 months ago. Yeah.
Doug, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Look forward to what this environment provides for us, and hopefully we'll get back online and discuss the positive impact on packaging technology and automation. Thanks again, Doug.
Yeah, my pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thanks.